Hey everybody, we have Joey Emont with us today, and we are going to be talking a little bit about the pelvis and the spine, specifically positioning the spine in squats and any sort of hinging movement, and going through some of the cues. So one of the common things that we teach is like trying to maintain a neutral spine, and some people are kind of unclear on what that is, but basically, neutral spine is going to have a slight lumbar extension curve, a slight thoracic flexion curve, and then a cervical extension curve. But they're all going to be fairly mild, but it's not a straight up and down spine. There's a curvature, like an S-shaped curve to the whole thing. And what's neutral for one person is slightly different based off of your structure and just kind of like, your entire time on planet Earth. So one of the things that we try and focus on is staying as close to that as possible when our goal is to load the extremities, because in that position, we have great leverage. And so we'll kind of break down why that is, and we'll also talk about what happens when we go into some of these other positions or use some of these cues, and how that can put us in maybe a disadvantageous position to be able to load the extremities. So I'll ask the first question for Joseph. We can go back and forth. So let's talk about the low back first. And let's talk about why it's important to maintain a certain degree of lumbar extension if we are going to do anything where we put a load transversely through the spine, like a squat and RDL, good morning type exercise.
Well, I mean, when you say extension, we're not talking about max extension, but we're just talking about the natural kind of the way that the lumbar has like you said, a natural kind of a lordotic curvature to it, even when it's in neutral. And that neutral position is, it's difficult to define a lot of times, because it's basically, what we're basically saying is somewhere in the middle of what your individual extremes are. And so what we're looking for is not necessarily like full extension or even like, like any extension really. What we're looking for is not full maxed out like trunk flexion, because at that point, when people start lifting, loading that spinal position when they're like rounded, now you're actually putting a lot of extra torque on these ligaments and the joints itself and the discs in between, and pushing them into a position that's just not, it's like you're relying on the leverage between like the structures rather than the musculature itself. And so I think a common misconception is, because the lumbar looks like it's semi-extended, just being in a quote unquote neutral position, that people often misinterpret that more arch is better, because but the thing is, from a safety standpoint, I think it's better than being rounded,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing.
Relatively, then it's better, because I'd rather see somebody hyperextend and then do a lift rather than being fully rounded, I think there's just too many like false kind of, there's a lot of misunderstandings in the industry. Like for a while there, like I remember that everybody was just afraid of even bending the spine in any direction. You know what I mean? And it was like, you couldn't even, like if somebody bent over with a rounded spine, even unloaded, like that was a terrible thing. And, I think that it's almost as extreme, that whole fully rounded, like rounding is bad period, versus like go full extension loaded. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like the same misinterpretation, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think context is always so important when we talk to these things, because a lot of times people make a generalization that can be true in one context and false in another, right? So, I mean, I think hopefully we're getting out of that stage where people are afraid to move the spine, but it's different when you're trying to move the spine when you're actually trying to train the spinal muscles versus you're trying to train your glutes or your hamstrings or your whatever, right? And in those cases, then we want the spine to stay somewhat rigid because essentially we just want it to function as a lever for the load, right? So we want it to stay in its mechanically most advantageous part so that we're expending the least amount of both neurological and biochemical energy to stabilize the spine and allow us to transfer however much load we can carry onto the hips in the most efficient way. That's the way we're going to target the tissue. And unfortunately, like with all of our barbell movements for the lower body, the spine can be a limiting factor, and it can add a lot of extra fatigue and stuff during the session that can take away from your ability to take some of those lower limb muscles completely a failure.
Right.
So, when we're talking about this, I think the context, for today's discussion is we're going to talk about this for lower body training, not spinal training. So essentially the context of trying to keep the spine in a position to resist flexion. And I think that's the most important thing for people to take is that, yeah, the worst case scenario for your spine is this. It's the fishing pole like thing or whatever, right? And when you have that, essentially, like, this is not an arch like a bridge where you have two anchors like that, you get stability through this. This is not attached to the ground. So essentially, this is the least advantageous position for all of these posterior muscles here to be able to resist force. So when people like if we look at the discussion of shear forces, which would be the force going through the spine. If I use another prop here, I'm cheating with props because it's just easy, right? So if we look at the spine, right, the shearing force is the force in like this type of force, right? So what happens when we get to a bit of an arch is we start to arch up these erector muscles as they start to pull. They have a little bit of like an elevation quality, like their moment to be able to resist that shear is a little bit better. So that's why maintaining an arch is a stronger position, but from a joint mechanics perspective, and then from a safety perspective, when we look at the spine in terms of extension of these joints, they're going to be limited just by the facets, right? But when we get into flexion, and that's actually what this whole little thing here is for, is when we get into flexion and we start pinching this way, if you watch the disc here and try not to vomit, boom, it coming out the other side, right? So that's where like we get the bulge disc, right? So just watch that a whole bunch of times. This is why you don't fishing pole deadlift, right? Like just this thing popping out here. So it's hard to get as much compression of the disc this way. There's still some. So excessively arching more than needed is still going to be like, we'll put it this way. You can't put any pressure other than like straight that isn't going to in some way pinch either the disc or some part of the facets like the joint, right? So the best thing from a like disc health perspective is to maintain close to this neutral position, especially when we have a load traversing through it this way. When we start to get into this position, obviously we don't have a lot of compressive force here other than what's coming from the musculature itself, right? But the more load we have, the more muscular tension that has to be compressing the spine in order to resist that. So I think what's important for you guys to just get from the get-go is that flexion is worse, extension is better, but relative extension. So if I bring this guy up into kind of what a neutral position would be, like there's a relative extension in that lumbar spine. And so the goal that I usually try to tell people is that we're trying to resist flexing from that position. And I don't think that the best strategy to do that is to try and excessively extend, right? Because even though that may be, we'll say, like slightly advantageous to the joint levers, as muscles start to shorten, it becomes more expensive for them to be in that position. They start to lose a little bit of their tensile strength, and it simply costs more fuel to be there. So you're expending more work by having to shorten more motor units, so there's more neural drive, more energy being expended because like you're not getting the same amount of tension per like amount of fuel that you're expending. So if we're talking about trying to keep the spine in optimal mechanics, I'm going to say we try and stay at the end of neutral in terms of lumbar extension. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because like from a standpoint of this, even the central nervous system, like I always like to talk about the central nervous system as like a battery that has a finite amount of energy. Okay. And if you want to get the maximum drive out of like any particular muscle group that you're trying to train, if you're distracting the nervous system by pushing a bunch of energy into a different joint system, like your lumbar, and your lumbar is being like cranked this way, and you're trying to really keep that arch maximized, like you're co-contracting, and you're kind of forcing your brain and your nervous system to try to focus and manage so many different things that you're likely going to change the general output of your primary muscles that you're trying to train in the first place. So, I mean, even if you pull off a lift in that particular way, you're probably understimulating the muscles that you're trying to train just because of the fact that you're distracting yourself by doing a whole bunch of excessive nonsense. Because we have that curve that we look at from like the strength in different lengths of a muscle, right? And in general, like once a muscle gets to its very shortest position, like all the sarcomeres are almost like past their optimal position of being able to really like create a good amount of tension. So you're actually like, once you shorten them past a certain range, they actually get a lot weaker. And then you go to a place where they can create an optimal amount of tension. And then once you go beyond that, muscularly, they also become weaker again once they're lengthened. However, the chart also shows something that is almost counterintuitive, because it actually goes up like exponentially. But what we're representing there is not the muscular capacity to produce force. We're actually looking at the ligamentous structures and all the passive structures that are getting more and more taut. And so not only is that like, yeah, you may be able, that's why people default to that fishing pole position, because they can basically rely on all of the tensile strength of their ligaments and the, all their passive structures to just continue to crank out a rep, which they're very strong in, but, rep after rep after rep, and they're going to end up carrying something.
That's a short-lived system though, right? That, having the passive tissues in there, right? That depends on that stress shortening cycle. So like if you have a slow rep, you start to lose that. Like, and that's usually what you see is somebody like they're doing the fishing pole deadlift. They don't hurt themselves the second they started. It's like, it's like a grindy rep. And then that's where somebody blows it, because you start to lose the tensile strength of that passive tension as you start getting away from that stretch reflex, because you build it up on the eccentric and then it starts dissipating as you're going through the rep. So it's like that's kind of that's a great safety mechanism for when you need to be reactive. But when we're doing like repetitive reps, or you're doing a heavy enough load that it slows you down, we start to lose the capacity to use that really fast.
Let me ask you something, because I don't know if this is necessarily bro science or whatever, but the common thought or the common knowledge that I've kind of gathered is typically the first thing to move in a repetition, or the first thing to activate in a motion that's loaded for the central nervous system, tends to be the thing that stays active the majority of the time throughout the rest of the rep, right? So if the first thing you do is like arch your back before you like move into a deadlift or a squat or whatever it is, like would that, on top of the other potential like muscular like strength deficit reasons, would that maybe change the end result of that rep just because it's the first thing that you move, or the first thing your brain puts its attention towards?
Yeah, so you have to consider, like, that's part of the neurological solution. So if I place load in a tissue or tension in a tissue and it starts acting on the load, okay? It is more complicated for me to release that tissue and start passing it off. That's a more neurologically complex thing than maintaining control around that joint that's already got this vector of force in it and just managing that. It's easier to maintain tension in a muscle and continue to drive with that than it is to shift things around. That becomes a much more complicated exercise from a neurological and a coordination perspective. So the first thing that we load, it takes a lot of loss of leverage for our body to want to go away from that thing. right? And so we're starting to do it, right? So if you drive your hips back first, you load more of the posterior muscle, which is like driving the knees forward. For like a lot of little things that we can do. But once a certain group of muscles is managing the force around that joint, it's almost risky for your body to be reducing the tension in that joint and trying to transfer to other, because you create a scenario for error, right? And a lot more coordination is now needed. So what it's going to tend to do is rely more on that. Now, it doesn't mean that like you can't mechanically override that. I mean, you have to do whatever is mechanically, but if you were to compare the scenario, yeah. Right. If you were to compare that scenario with and without preloading that tissue, or making that be the tissue that takes the load first, is going to bias it a little bit, right? Another aspect that I want to talk about, and I think you'll probably actually do a better job of explaining this, is it's not just the shortness thing, but when we look at some of these muscles, like for instance, like we have the QL fibers that kind of come in here at an angle, and we have the erectors that are coming up. A lot of them are coming up and they're attaching like, a couple inches off on the ribs and stuff like that. And it's almost like we have the erectors from here and here. If you were to look at it, I'll put an image for this, but they kind of like overlap to make this nice, smooth extension chain that goes all the way down, from cranium to sacrum. But a lot of those have a rotational or side bend type vector to them. And as we start to extend the spine, their angle of pull actually starts to become greater towards the side flexion and rotation. So it's not only the shortness of the muscle, but actually the angle the muscle is pulling becomes less efficient at resisting flexion as we get into these shorter positions, right? Especially if you look at something, like the QL, as we start coming through here, it's starting to pull more transversely, right? And maybe even like depending on how much of a lordotic curve and pelvic tilt, it could even have a small flexion vector at a certain point, right?
Well, that's a really interesting point that you're bringing up, because there's probably a lot of truth to that. But I would kind of, when you're saying all this stuff, like the thought that comes through my mind is kind of the same idea behind like how we talk a lot about not necessarily actively really like pinching the shoulders back when you're trying to bench press, because like the rhomboid muscle specifically is a continuation of the serratus. Like they're fascially the same thing. So they will reciprocally inhibit one another, or at the very least, like create a co-contraction that's very inefficient, right? When you're trying to push force this way and you're creating kind of this opposite like neurological effect, leaving the anterior like without a lot of stability. Well, the same thing takes place in the pelvis essentially, because your QL is actually a continuation of your iliacus muscle, right? Which creates hip flexion. So the thing is, if you're actually like cranking up on your QL while you're trying to like move into a position where your hips are having to manage hip flexion, you potentially are, well, there's a lot of reasons mechanically from a joint standpoint that this would not be ideal, but from a muscular standpoint, which is what I'm talking about right now, that can also compromise your range of motion and your stability in a full hip flex position, right? Mm-hmm. Just because you're putting these things out of a place where, from like a sarcomere standpoint or from a neurological, like reciprocal inhibition standpoint, like the tissues are fighting each other, right, for optimal positioning throughout the movement. So you're kind of like, yeah, you're inhibiting the muscles that are important to help you to move smoothly through the range of motion you're trying to achieve, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about the top side here really quick. So, because one of the things we talk about is this head position, right? And, not necessarily trying to like crank the neck up. And there's two components to that that you have to consider. One is the mechanical that's going on, and the other is just the intent of the person. So the whole cue of like looking up or chest up, like it can come from a variety of things. But I think the initial goal of that cue is to resist spinal flexion. It's to resist us from falling into flexion, right? But what are we really trying to accomplish, and what are the cons if we are to extend this too much? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but so as we go through capital extension, which is where like the skull is like being extended back, right, is what we have to have is a reciprocal cervical extension to go with that, right? So as you start to look up, this has to accommodate with that. And what tends to happen then is because like our spine does not, even though this spine does, our spine doesn't move like this, right? What actually happens is as this starts to go, in order for this to compensate for that, it kind of does this, right? So it moves in this, like, so as this extends, this flexes, right? And that's kind of how our spine does the majority of its stuff. I mean, we have a limited capacity to do this, right? But a lot of times what'll happen, because you got to think these muscles start to pull here. So as this starts to pull here, in order to resist that, the muscles that pull from here are going to start flexing this way to maintain that rigidity. So what I tend to see is with people that are trying to look up too much is this extension tends to actually lead to more extension in the lumbar spine, especially as people are going down, right? So for me, personally, I try not have people look up, but also the goal is not to do this. The goal is to maintain somewhat of a neutral spine. And what I like for that is to maintain relative neutral extension is that, like, okay, we do kind of think about like pulling the head back, which is going to get us a little bit of C-spine, like a little bit of C-spine extension, but it's not going to be enough that it starts to create this huge downstream extension. And actually the drill I usually give most people is if you actually take and you do like the chin tuck motion, which I would say for the most part, it's kind of almost the closest thing we can do to like trying to traction the spine or making it straight is this kind of like tucking motion. And usually what they'll find is there's an end stop then to their lumbar extension. Like if they don't go to full, they go to, my theory is that in that position, when you try to extend your spine, it kind of holds you to the end range of neutral, right? So it's like, if you consider neutral as kind of this range, when we do that position, then if you try and pull your chest back and up and you try and hold your low back, you end up naturally stopping at, I think, your most advantageous point to
Yeah.
resist flexion.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's any other mechanisms going on there, because to be honest, I mean, that's something that, just looking at the way spinal mechanics work, looking at the anatomy, and then anecdotally using that in the gym, I will say the biggest place that we see it, like, when we have people squatting and we see a lot of like valgus and knee caving and stuff because the glutes are shutting off. A lot of times if I see that and people are looking up, if I do nothing else other than change that chin position, I don't have to teach them to like bear down and try and shit out a watermelon or any of these other fucking cues. I usually just do that, and all of a sudden the valgus goes away and their technique tends to get a lot better. They're a lot more stable. They can do more load. I mean, usually if you give somebody a cue and you haven't given them a mechanical advantage, but they're instantly stronger, that's a good thing, right?
Sure. Yep. Yeah, and I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you know any other mechanisms that are going on there. I wish I had a better, like, pure scientific explanation of like what happens, but here very, very soon we will be able to throw some force gauges and EMG sensors and a whole bunch of stuff to be able to kind of illustrate what's going on with these things. But I think everything that's happening up here, it's the downstream effect that's causing all of those benefits or negatives depending on the position, right?
Well, it's
So
the thing about that is that I mean, from a common sense standpoint, it's like if you're going to change, like, the whole body is obviously it's all connected and related, right? So every time there's a joint that changes somewhere, another joint has to compensate to change so that you can maintain your center of gravity over your base of support. Always the case, right? And so if you're going to start creating excessive curves in one part of the spine, the rest of the spine is going to have to make adjustments, just kind of like what you were saying. And of course, we have two lumbar curves in our spine. We have the C-spine lumbar curve, and then we have the C-spine lordotic curve is what I meant to say. And then we've got the lumbar lordotic curve, right? And then the kyphotic curve in the T-spine. And the more that one gets curved, then the other one is going to have to compensate in order to maintain kind of this like center line of like mass over gravity, right? Or and there is something that's described. A lot of chiropractic circles, they understand this. It's called the Lovett brother relationship. And what they describe is a very close relationship between like C1 and L5 and C2 and L4 and C3 and L3 and, you know, and so on and so forth. And so it moves in this kind of like backwards thing. And essentially the rationale for that, basically what they're saying is that, and I see it all the time with treatments and stuff, is that you'll see people that have like a neck problem, but they'll also, the corresponding vertebra in their lumbar has a problem too. Right. So they'll have like a corresponding herniation, like down at L5, and then their L1 is out, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. And that's more reinforcement to your point that there's an intimate connection between your cervical spine and your lumbar. But also, if you think about it, like when you're walking in normal gait, you have a pelvis that's kind of rotating this way, and you've got your T-spine that has to kind of rotate the other way. But if your T-spine's rotating this way and your pelvis is rotating this way, like your head is also kind of like relatively rotating in the opposite direction. And so they're kind of mirroring each other nicely like this. So every time your lumbar moves in one direction, so the C-spine moves the same, similar way to the same degree. And so there's this intimate kind of like thing that goes, it's like a, you know, this rhythm that takes place between your C-spine and your L-spine. And so, I mean, there's no reason to think that that wouldn't exist also in any other part of movement. You know, like when you're loading your spine for a squat or something like that, you start manipulating your C-spine naturally. Since you do this every single day, it's a part of normal movement, right? Your lumbar is going to follow your C-spine motion. So, you know, so there is an absolute connection between like the curvature of your C-spine and your L-spine. They are intimately related in every way, shape, and form. And so if you limit one, you're going to limit the other. And if you excessively move one, you're going to start to compensate by excessively moving the other. And, you know, in martial arts, we always talk about the head controlling the head and the body will follow, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's probably as scientific as you need to get with that kind of thing. You know, it just makes sense that you're not going to be a bobblehead when you're trying to load your lumbar.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. So I want to bring up some points from a recent podcast that I did with Mike Israetel, where we were talking about the way that he performs the good morning. And he does this for the squat too, so we can kind of go through like both scenarios here. But what he essentially is doing is he is leading with cervical extension, lumbar extension, and anterior pelvic tilt in both of those movements, right? So it's this very neck cranked up, chest out, lumbar arched, and then he goes to the movement. I think his rationale for the squat is like that's how, like, I mean, it's an he uses the Chinese weightlifters as an example of like the looking up thing. But even if you look at them, their cervical extension is usually not that excessive, right? So I mean, occasionally you see something, and the other thing you notice is that as soon as they can, it comes back to neutral. Like you can guarantee that as soon as they're like actually going through the lift, it comes back to neutral really fast. But on the good morning, the case that he was making was that this anterior pelvic tilt, right? So like cocking this thing this way was pre-stretching the hamstrings before like he was like starting to descend the lift, right? And I'll let you go ahead and speak first on what you think of that idea. And if there's any pro to it or what the cons would be, and then I guess I'll give my feedback.
Yeah, that sounds odd to me, and the only reason why I can think that is because just by, you know, if you can put a lot of load on your spine, like actually loading, right, and then you start changing the position of your vertebra underneath that, because you're still stacked on top of the load, you're not really loading anything. So it seems like you're kind of coming closer to an end range before you've actually had a chance to train that end range, you know? So that doesn't really make sense to me. And if you're pre-stretching the hamstrings, which are the primary like mover in that motion or controller of that motion downward, you essentially are limiting your ultimate range of motion coming down, because if you kind of create a pelvic tilt and you're lengthening before you put load on them. And it's kind of the same idea behind, like, you know, well, I know we've talked about this, like putting chains on a deadlift where you're making something excessively heavy towards the part of the motion where you're basically just stressing out your joints. So to me, it just seems like, well, if ultimately what I'm after is to train the muscles to produce more force more efficiently through a greatest range of motion, if you're shortening the range of motion on purpose without load, right, that seems like it defeats the purpose. Plus, you're limiting your range of motion as you go into it. So you're likely to put more load to make up for it because axially and mechanically you can handle it, but you're actually just loading a smaller portion of the range of the hamstring, and you're also like shortening like the distance from the axis of rotation, which means that you would have more leverage without necessarily muscularly making like a significant effort. So you might be fooled into thinking that because you can load more that way, that it's better. But that
Yeah,
doesn't
and
make sense to me biomechanically. I mean, maybe you can speak to that.
yeah, I think if anything, it's got to be a sensation-based thing. Like that's got to be the positive correlation to it. It's like
So
just putting
feel
yourself into that position gives you a feel to it, right? And then the question is, how much of it is it a hamstring versus how much is it adductor at that point too, right? Because I think, I mean, the main thing that I tend to see is when people do that excessive anterior pelvic tilt, is that they tend to be able to get less out of the glutes. I tend to see more valgus type things going on, and internal rotationing stuff, which to me shows that like the glutes are less involved in managing that load, which I don't think is a good thing. Because I mean, if we're doing an RDL or anything where it's a relative straight knee and we're emphasizing kind of like where the hamstrings reach their stretch, it's going to be hamstring, and it's going to be hamstring dominant anyway, in that particular motion, right? So I don't think we need to disadvantage the glutes in any way, shape, or form. But one thing I would say in practice, what I've seen is that people aren't usually actually able to load that more. And I think it's because they're like, this becomes a stability factor, right? So even though,
stretching all the way
like,
and bending over, then
yeah,
would put
right.
the muscles at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and so and then taking the glutes out of it a little bit. So I see the pelvic, and I see the stability usually is a hard, more challenging factor as people go through that movement, right? So it tends, I tend to see people will they will bend the knee earlier,
Mm.
in that type of a movement as well, which again tells me that the hams, yeah, right.
Because they're just
Um,
they taught. Well, yeah,
right. So that if anything, the body's trying to take the load off the hamstrings a little
this is
bit
yeah.
in that
This is
manner.
specific to the good morning though, right? You're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Um, so I mean, I think an important thing when we're looking at that is just like, okay, you don't need to pre-stretch the hamstrings in an exercise where if this motion is the first motion, the hamstrings are the first thing receiving stretch
Mm.
anyway. And as you said, if we start stretching, like if we start moving the hamstrings like this, essentially we're doing that with minimal load. But the second we start actually leaning forward, we're placing load on that. So we're missing stimulus by doing this versus doing this,
You're missing
right?
like 20% or 25% or more of your rep potential
Yeah,
loading,
right.
range
Yeah.
on hamstring.
Now,
You know?
I think it's also fair to say, like, to that point, this is not the most valuable or highest tension portion of the exercise period, but still, I mean, there's no reason to take it out, right, for what benefit it does have. Um,
It
and then
just
I think
yes, sorry. It just seems like by the time you get to the bottom of your rep, like you're not in a similar position to be able to like use the hamstrings appropriately to like even right yourself again,
yeah, right, because that's the other thing is then if we consider the bottom position, right, so hip flexion is going to be relationship between the pelvis and the femur, right? So if we say that this ends here, right, then what we're talking about is like, okay, if this was a neutral spine position and then this was our extended, like our lordotic like version that we went into or whatever, if we were able to achieve the same amount, right, in this position the weight's closer to our legs, but the tissue, like we're expending a lot more energy in those erectors, right? So from a neurological standpoint, from a biochemical standpoint, this is I would have to use more load to get the same amount of tension on my hamstrings, and I'm expending a lot more energy at the spinal level, both biochemical and neurological, to be able to resist the flexion force versus being in like kind of that mechanically suited thing. So from a stimulus to fatigue ratio, one, we're missing out on stimulus by going through the anterior pelvic tilt without resistance, and then we're adding fatigue by creating a more disadvantageous spinal position at which we are going to, you know, try and maintain that load, right? And I mean, if your goal is to load these muscles, you have to make all of this as easy as possible, people. Like, because if this fatigues first, guess what? You're not getting enough stimulus in anything in the rest of that, you know, the limb-based posterior chain, your glutes, your adductors, your hamstrings, whatever you're doing. And that includes if it's a squat, a deadlift, a good morning, an RDL, like all of those, the principles here is going to apply across the board to anything where we're loading the body in a hip flexed position, right?
Just seems to me like the rule of thumb here is that the target muscle that you're looking to accomplish like a stimulus in should be the only one moving through a full range of motion. Everything else should be in like the most mechanical advantage possible to help to provide stability, whether you're bench pressing or squatting or everything else. It's like, you know, your primary, if you max out multiple joints and or multiple ranges of motion or shorten other muscles that are kind of stabilizers, you're going to basically limit your ability to create a stimulus for the chosen muscle group in general. And so whether it's full lumbar extension to hit the hamstrings, you know, or whether it's, you know, full retraction and holding it to do a bench press, or full retraction to do tricep press downs, you know, that kind of thing. It's like you need your scapula to be somewhere in a mid-range so that everything can just kind of like stabilize properly to give your muscle that you want to take through a full range of motion optimally through that range of motion and be able to stimulate it maximally without necessarily wasting a lot of like muscular energy and or wasting a lot of like CNS, like, you know, like co-contraction, joint management, distraction type, you know, brain distraction, so that you can focus on what's, you know, what you're trying to do at hand. Now, does that maybe change though? Because we're referencing also like Chinese, I don't know why it always has to be a Chinese, you know, Olympic lifter. Why can't it be like a Lebanese, you know, whatever. Chinese Olympic lifters. That's that, you know, well, you're not Chinese.
Yeah.
But anyway, so, but in an athletic context, you know, does that change at all? If you're doing a good morning for like an athletic context, because you're just like, I'm doing a good morning, not to hit hamstrings, but I'm doing it because I want to improve my ability to take load from, maybe I want to even practice doing it from a disadvantage and just see what the hell happens. You know what I mean? Like, is that potentially a different scenario? You know what I mean?
Like, okay, so it's like you're asking, is there any possible reason that you would want to do it with the excessive
Sure. Like I
extension,
want to
right?
train it as like a whole unit. Like everything gets like stimulation. Like, hey, I don't care if it's fucked, just do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Like a total integrated, like posterior
Yes.
chain triple extension
Yep.
type thing, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I think it's important to understand that when we look at triple extension exercises, that they are like whipping momentum based exercises, right? So like there's the amount of load that you are carrying through spinal extension and stuff is drastically less than what you're doing from like that initial pull. Like if you look at somebody that's pulling from a snatch, right? They're almost in like a fucking like crouched squat position, you know, or bottom of deadlift position or whatever. You look at most Olympic lifters, their pull looks almost like a squat instead of a deadlift position. They're a little bit more upright, and it's more of a leg press off the floor. And then all of that triple extension happens after a lot of momentum has really decreased the load of that bar. And a big part of that lift is like getting under it, right? It's like, okay, I'm now using the load of that bar to be able to pull myself under it rather than actually trying to continue to lift it as much, right? You know, and that's the whole skill of Olympic lifting. The same thing goes for if you're doing like, you know, maybe you're not an Olympic lifter, but maybe you're just throwing medicine balls behind you. But all these exercises are momentum-based lifts where the amount of force we're having to overcome in the mid to all these extension ranges is significantly less. And you look at the trajectory of these things, they're not even straight through. I'm not throwing a medicine ball and I'm not like throwing it literally straight back here. It's always an up, like it's always almost like there's a decompressive aspect to it as you're going through that extension.
Sure.
And I think that's important to understand, like, okay, yeah, that's a totally different movement than when we have a barbell on our back, right? And we're doing this kind of slower, grindier, heavier movement that's requiring us to resist all of these shear forces with compression instead of the opposite, which is like the weight's kind of deloading and we're almost getting a traction based force, from the resistance. So I think if we're talking about this in the context of like motor coordination and stuff, I think there is, but I think it all comes down to, in those cases, this is all going to be unilateral stuff that's going to incorporate like some sort of rotation. Like if once we get to there, it's like we're not doing this. Like I don't think there's any context where I would say, hey, let's load the spine heavily and do this. We've had this discussion that I think when it comes down to trunk flexion and extension, I don't really see, like, if you're doing any sort of push or pull work, I don't see the need for any added bilateral flexion extension work, that it should all become unilateral for greater range of motion. And it's actually better for in terms, you have to think of it like, if I'm forcefully extending the spine, the end range of motion is I'm jamming the joints, the facets there, right? Like that's my goal. It's like, in no other exercise where is the goal of the end position to like smash the joint together. But if we're allowed to, add that rotation side bend component, now that's how the spine is supposed to move through these end ranges of flexion and extension. So I think if we're going to talk about doing these like total integrated movements in a weight training setting, they have to become unilateral and allow the normal joint mechanics.
I really like that, actually. That's great. Because essentially, like one thing I was going to say at the beginning when you were kind of talking to that point was that, it's one thing to describe the mechanics of an athletic motion, but it's a whole nother thing because you're not training for the best case scenario. You're training for the worst case scenario, Like if you got to do like a, 250 kilo, like snatch overhead, like, or whatever it is. I don't know how much they lift. Like 1,000 kilos overhead. Like you're going to accelerate it nicely, and then you're going to like drift under the bar and it's going to be over your center of gravity, mass, whatever. And then you're going to catch it perfectly. And then there it is. And there's less. But the thing is, like, in the worst case, like maybe you don't catch it perfectly. Like there's going to be points where it's like, okay, now you really have to muscle it up because you want those points on stage. Right. So,
yeah.
So the thing is, like, there should be a scenario where it's like, okay, now we're going to train for that by doing whatever. But what you're saying is that once you move to training specifically for these like less than optimal movements, like there's some other strength movements that would be way more beneficial, a place where you could spend your time more wisely in training that would take care of that in a much better way than trying to manipulate like a triple extension movement bilaterally through maximum, every joint maxed out, some semblance of strength work with that in that context, I should say.
Yeah, because I mean, when you look at transfer, if you're doing a deadlift or a squat, snatch grip deadlift or whatever to carry over into Olympic lifting, that carryover is only for like the first couple inches of that lift.
Yes.
Right? It has nothing to do with the rest of the lift, right? So it's like you're improving your ability to generate momentum in that bottom position, which is definitely going to help you lift more, right? But from a movement, and a motor recruitment standpoint, being able to deadlift 1,000,000 pounds is not necessarily helping you in the catch, other than the fact that it allowed you to generate more, like, if anything, you generate momentum, so you got to catch more weight, right? So, but there's no point in trying to like hyperextend in the deadlift to make it more like to try and improve its carryover. It's like use it for what it's good for, and then if there's something else to benefit from, or if there's something else that could benefit the other portion of the lift, do it directly, right? I think a lot of people get in the mindset, and I see this a lot of times because like, we teach new exercises and stuff sometimes, right? And I think for the majority of part, most people that like give a new exercise, it's usually not an improvement on the old. A lot of times they've added more components, but by doing that, they've made it not good at any one of those particular things. And those things tend to only be viable for like beginners that are just like, yeah, doesn't have to be that good. You just got to do, like, you're not training, you're working out at that point, right? But as soon as you get into training, like those exercises where it's like, oh, look, you know, I put a bunch of like different things and now it's a super combo exercise that hits all these things. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't hit any of them well enough, right?
Mm-hmm. 100%. Yeah. So yeah, that's a valuable distinction to make, for sure.
So another thing I wanted to ask you about that you can probably describe better than me again is going to be when we get into these positions of excessive arch and the spine is like, see, this is what happens when you do go through too much extension. You just rotate your spine out of place. So when you get into this position, right, and we have a load now coming through here, one of the things that like isn't like, because if you just pull with these things, especially since they're losing leverage, it's not that much. So a huge component in maintaining this arch is the pull of the psoas muscle, which is a hip, well, it's not a hip flexor, it's a trunk to femur flexor, whatever you want to call it, right? It's a hip flexor, but not attaching to the pelvis, I guess is the best way to say it, right? So, but that guy is coming through here and is actually pulling this stuff forward. It's part of what helps you maintain that arch, right? So as we start to add load that would like push us this way, is it possible, I mean, because in practice, I would say this is what I see, is that I tend to see people actually have issues with like the psoas becoming either hypertonic and stuff like that when they're doing a lot of this excessive lumbar extension they're going through. And that's where people, they complain about the low back pain. And then when we investigate what's causing like the low back pain, there's always something psoas related. And I always see that it's in these people that are like excessively lumbar extending in these movements. And that's also where I see people that tend to get, like, that will need like, they'll need like a chiropractic or something, or so some type of adjustment. And you'll actually like, there'll actually be an adjustment at the lumbar spine, like, because it's just kind of being pulled anteriorly that whole time. I mean, do you want to kind of walk us through the forces and what you think is kind of going on there? Oh, look, see, I got a little bulgy disc on this side too, right? Yeah, see, don't do that.
Well, it's interesting because, the psoas, I think, is still like a big mystery because if it's like it crosses the axis, it could be a trunk flexor, but it could also enhance extension based on, what other muscles are doing to stabilize and neutralize other motions and things like that. And then you got to ask yourself the question, what came first? Was it the chicken or the egg? Are they already like hyperlordotic because they have the psoas is excessively tight, and when they stand up, that's just their natural position anyway. So you go load it and they already look like shit doing the movement, or are they like moving into a position where that's the only place that they're stable? And a lot of times it could even be because their psoas is weak, so the psoas has to kind of stay in a place where it can actually contract like at a decent capacity in order to keep stability for the lumbar spine, right? But the thing that sticks out to me right away is that, I also consider the pelvis like the lowest lumbar vertebra. You know what I mean? It's a part of the spine, just like any other piece of the vertebra, moving up. So when you create that level of like arch or anterior tilt, what you're doing is you're almost like, it's the same as like what you're describing. It's like you're kind of maxing out part of the motion that you're intending to train ahead of time before you actually do the movement. Like when you anterior pelvic tilt so much before you're actually into the movement, what you're doing is you're also limiting the space to which you can hip flex. And so you're increasing the likelihood that the anterior portion of the capsule in the hip socket will actually meet too soon. And so you end up getting an abbreviation to like your hip flexion motion. And so you're constantly creating this kind of like impingement type situation, when you're moving in and out of a squat or whatever, with that full kind of lordotic extended kind of position. And so that alone you know, for that reason alone, I would say it's enough to not move into that excessive of an arch, because you actually are limiting the depth that you can move into the squat. And so the thing is, if somebody's used to doing that for so long, for whatever reason, whether they're already too excessively tight, or that's just the way they learned it, or they continue to just be reinforcing that pattern over and over and over again, they're also like continuously like banging into their anterior hip capsule, which can lead to like some labral problems. And so like I see that all the time, and I see people that are trying to squat and they end up, their squat is abbreviated for whatever reason, and then as soon as I correct either neck or lumbar position or both, their squat depth increases. You know, and some might say, well, that's because of a stability thing, but I would argue to say it's even more of a structural thing, you know?
Yeah. Do you see a correlation with this stuff in knee pain as well?
Yeah. I can't say that I've like, I can pinpoint some stuff, but I have seen it before. Yes. I've seen, because you're not putting the pelvis in a position where like, you know, the main transfer of like from your like glutes and your external rotator and stuff is your IT band, right? Which has a dramatic impact on like patellar tracking and stuff like that. But then from the inside, you've also got your adductors, which are kind of pivotal in keeping that like the femoral position like moving in a way that's like healthy for where the hip capsule needs to be in order for you to descend fully into a squat. So soon as I change that pelvic position and you give everything kind of a more harmonious and like symbiotic way of functioning, like all of a sudden, yeah, a lot of times you'll see like knee pain go away. Actually, this happened to me last week. I had a girl that she was like squatting and like just because we don't squat a lot, you know. So it's probably been like 4 weeks since I put her under a barbell, and you know, she got into the barbell and she just started doing like weird shit. I was like, what is going on? And she's like, well, my knee hurts. so, so I was like, well, that might be because you're doing this, this, and that. Let's just play with that a little bit, you know? And I just tweaked a few things. Like I was like, hey, you know, here, head position, let's change your stance a little bit. And then boom, it was like no knee pain anymore. So she was able to do like a relatively like healthy looking full depth squat within, you know, 30 seconds. So,
Awesome.
So to answer your question, yes.
Yeah, because when I'm looking at this, both from like when I'm looking at like the story of what's happening under this load here, is what I'm seeing is like, okay, if we get into this state of excessive lumbar extension, and there's a reciprocal increase in amount of work that the psoas needs to do, right? That's adding flexion force, right? So it's essentially, it's like adding load, right? So we're basically increasing the co-contraction there, right? So that reciprocally increases the amount of work that the erectors have to do. So it's like, okay, I'm wasting energy there, but also then I'm looking at, well, the body's always trying to solve the problem of how to expend the least amount of energy. So if it's trying to reduce the amount of force that's being pulled this way, or if it's trying to reduce how much I'm fighting the psoas by, you know, going this way, et cetera, whatever it may be, or hip extending, I'm sorry, pulling back up, you know, is that going to essentially kind of like decrease the drive in some of those hip extensors, because your body's trying to hold that psoas contraction, and it's like, well, if I pull too hard with my glutes or my adductors, right, then I'm going to have an issue. And I swear I see that, like, you've seen somebody like I just watched this like Vivian Winkler's Instagram the other day. She showed up. I mean, she's doing like, the girl is just an absolute beast. She's doing like a 95-pound RDL, right? You know, which you look at her muscle mass and she should be able to do like a 950-pound RDL. Right. But you look at it and she's like shaking, like all like, you know, like, and I'm like, that has to be just massive amounts of co-contraction going on, trying to manage that. Like, it's like, oh, protect the spine. No, not the psoas. And then it's like this, the body is fighting itself. And I think that all originates from this position, right? 100%. That starts this cascade where the body starts fighting itself. And so you get those people they kind of get that shakiness, right? Or almost like an artificial tightness. Like they'll have an abbreviated they'll have an abbreviated range of motion under that load versus where they could go. Like you'll see a huge difference between their passive range of motion and then their loaded range of motion. And I think it's because of all that increased co-contraction.
Yeah. Well, I think that we've been conditioned not to like, well, this is a whole nother thing that we can talk about too, but like we've been conditioned not to activate our psoas at all, like just cut it out.
Yeah.
You might as well just take it out because, you know, so we've been encouraged not to train it in any way, shape or form. And I think that's really wrong because we need a lot of strength in our psoas. It's this muscle that does so many things for our stability through our spine and our pelvis. And, you know, but if you're putting it in a bad position when you're trying to move through a motion that it's primarily involved in, like you're also talking about risking changes in the way that joint centrates itself, you know, as it's moving. And so you have to remember too that the joint itself sends signals back to the central nervous system, and it can send signals that inhibit a bunch of muscles around it independent of what the brainstem is saying or doing, you know? So it's like, if the joint's getting signals that say, hey, fuck off, I don't know what you're doing, you know, you're going to be dealing with like a whole bunch of inhibitory signals, and the rest of your muscles that you're consciously aware of are going to be trying to do whatever they can do while you're saying like, nope, this is what I need to do. And then you get through the motion anyway, and you're just shaking like, you know, like you're on like a level 10 of like, you know, power plate.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, because we often, but that's common, man. Like when we're training, when we're in the gym, like we are conditioning ourselves day in and day out to ignore our body's signals, because if we did listen to everything our brains and bodies told us, they're like, hey, when you're doing this biceps curl, it really hurts, you know? And we're kind of saying, nope, put the elbow there, continue through the rep. And if I have a training partner, make sure I get 7 more like forced reps and keep going no matter what, you know? So when we feel discomfort, and we've been doing this for years and years and years, when you start to descend into an RDL of some sort, and your low back and your hips are like screaming at you, and you have soreness and, you know, tension in weird places and stuff, we're, especially those of us that are, you know, Instagram models or whatever, we've been doing this for our entire lifetime or whatever, like they're likely to just push through all that and ignore all the signals that their body's saying, like, hey, you're not stable enough for this. You're shaking like a baby goat, you know?
Yeah. That's actually an important thing because, you know, there's been a lot of research done recently that shows that like we can train ourselves to the point where those things where we're just not consciously aware of them at all anymore, right? Yep. So we can think that through grinding through that movement that we have somehow our body has adapted and now it is a good movement for us because of the absence of those painful sensations or whatever. And it's really just that we've just lost the ability to sense it, or like we're just not consciously sensing it anymore. Yep. Which I think is a really, really potential harmful thing for some people, because they end up validating this movement over time by just pushing through the pain. And now what's going to happen is they're going to get injured, and they're going to wonder why. Right? You know, because it's like, oh, I don't know, it felt fine until it didn't, right? That's how a lot of injuries occur, right? Most people don't go into a set like the previous set. They're like, man, something felt really off and funky, and then I decided to add more weight and do it again, right? I mean, yeah, sure, some people have won some Darwin Awards doing that, but a lot of people, you know, they just went right into the next thing thinking nothing was wrong, and then they got hurt, right? And I think this is probably plays a big picture in some of those cases.
100%. I mean, we saw it recently with that one guy who was doing all the moves, and it was just like he seemed like he had the proper flexibility to do everything properly, but he was just kind of like pressing in full external rotation or something. Yeah, remember?
I'm trying to think of which one this was. Was that the Smith press one, or which one are you talking about?
I'm about pressing like this or whatever.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
But the thing is, like, and you've been talking about stuff like that for a long time, and then I saw it. That was like one of the primary like things. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. But the thing is, it made me realize that I also have a lot of that myself, you know, when I train. And what's interesting is how much I've actually had to like deconstruct and detrain myself from doing all these things that I'm just so used to because I've been in the gym for, you know, 20 years, like just learning to do these things. And there's a lot of things that I've kind of learned how to do that I take for granted. There's things that I've learned to do like in a different way over the last 10 years. And now I'm having to like unlearn a lot of the stuff. And it's amazing to me how even if I know better, there's still certain moves where I'm like, shit, I'm doing that thing again, you know, because it's just so ingrained in like the body movement. And I think that this stuff really keeps us from identifying where are the major, you know, sticking points in all of our motions and where we're loading things and what are proper sensations and what are not proper sensations. What should I be looking for? What should I not be looking for? And stuff like that. So, you know, I'm very, very cautious too about like with my own clients, how I actually like cue them and talk them through different motions now, because, you know, actually I was working out with, you know, someone the other day and they were kind of like coaching me through something that they thought I should be doing. And I just noticed that based on their cues, how it felt for me, you know, to be listening to what they were doing. And so they were telling me like, hey, push into this thing. And I was pushing already. And so I started pushing more and my movement got like really dysfunctional because I was already doing the thing that they told me to do. And then they told me to do it some more, you know? So it's like, you know, and so you can really kind of like neurologically, like really jack people up because, especially if you're constantly reinforcing like the wrong things. And so that's why
when it comes to cues, it's always better to let the body figure it out on its own unless you absolutely know that that cue is needed, right?
So all that stuff, it's really important. And so it's becoming kind of this mismanager because of this like excessive arch. It's kind of the same thing as with the bench press, you know, like you're over recruiting the rhomboids and that causes the serratus not to do a stability job. You're doing the same thing in the squat. You're arching your low back, you're creating tension through your QL and your multifidus and all this, these kind of antagonists to the hip flexor complex. And now you're keeping them from being able to really manage the joint up and down, in and out of that motion as a primary stabilizer and centrator of the femoral head, you know? So I think absolutely that can be a massive problem.
Yeah. And that carries right into, I think, the last point that we'll go over on the pelvis, right? So another thing that came up with in that was I was having trouble illustrating a lot of or communicating a lot of things to Mike. I think because I was just a little bit frustrated at that point in the podcast. It was 2 hours in. I probably needed to eat, and who knows what else is going on, right? But one of the things was just like getting the
like Chris Kresser in that vegan argument. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
Oh my God, it's worth it, dude. Just like watch about 15 minutes, like maybe 1 hour in. You just skip through. Like watch for 15 minutes, like, or at least watch like 2 minutes at the beginning just to see how he was like, well, this is what I'm talking about. And then like an hour in, he was just like, yeah, okay. Right. He is so defeated.
Just,
All
right, well, it wasn't quite like that. It was more of like I just started getting to the point where I felt like I was saying things that were obvious and they ended up not being obvious, and so I felt like I was just repeating myself, it's just a challenge sometimes talking to people when, especially about biomechanics, when you're talking, you know, leverage and nervous system, and somebody else is talking more anecdotal experience. Like it's just there's a language barrier thing going on, right? But anyway,
so you know, it's
right.
But we're gonna put EMGs to this.
Yeah, we're gonna put a variety of things to this, right? Because EMG in itself is not the end all be all. In fact, it's extremely far from it. It's what we're gonna show is how limiting. Well, a combination of how limiting the EMG can be, but also how valuable it can be. Because I don't think anybody's actually taking advantage of what EMG is really going to be good for, which is going to be assessing more dispersion of load at equal ranges of motion. So it's like looking at the same different exercises with the same relative mechanical levers, but changes in force vectors and things like that and setups or whatever to show like how the load ends up getting redispersed amongst different tissues rather than trying to assess the magnitude of a single tissue under different conditions, because it's just like you're not comparing apples to apples at that point, right? And that's the whole thing with like the thing with hip thrust, whatever. But staying on track, so when we look at pelvic stability, and we talk about this, I always like my little steering wheel thing where I talk about, you got all these muscles pulling one way and all these muscles pulling the other way. And to manage this joint, I essentially want all of those to be able to do their job as efficiently as possible in every aspect of the rep. And so one of the things was when I said that, okay, if we hyperextend here and we do this anterior pelvic tilt, that's going to start shutting down the glutes. And then Mike was like, well, okay, like wouldn't that be better for hamstrings if we're inhibiting the glutes? And my mindset is always try and get the most out of the tissue you're trying to train by choosing exercises that load it efficiently, but don't ever try and get more out of a muscle group by taking away something that is a stabilizer or part of that integrated system. Because if you picked an exercise where and your appropriate variables, your tempo, your range of motion, etc., where that tissue is going to be the thing that works the most, your nervous system is going to use the best tool for the job. But the second you start kind of clipping away the little helpers and synergists and antagonists, you're only going to decrease the output, right? Now you might immediately feel more sensation in that tissue, because it's essentially, if we take away some stability, all of a sudden that movement becomes more complex, right? And it may not be a movement that you have as good of programming for, right? Your motor programming, it's like as soon as you start making something that's a little dysfunctional at the joint, we tend to have less solutions to bad scenarios than we do, optimal scenarios. Because I mean, if you think about it, like when you don't intentionally put yourself in your bad positions, your body tries to avoid going into bad or weak or compromised positions, period. So we just don't have as much experience programming or solutions for that. So, but maybe you, since I failed at explaining why taking the glutes out of here would destabilize the pelvis or any muscle from that matter, maybe you can explain that better than I could.
Yeah, well, I'll try, but I don't know that I can. I mean, the thing is, this is a big point of debate. I can see how people would think like, well, if I take other things out, that other things will be forced to work more, and that's better.
Yeah.
I can totally see that mentality, and it reminds me actually of like another situation that I remember learning about in when we were going through RTS, because we talked about the difference between engaging like the soleus versus the gastrocnemius, right? In a seated whatever, calf raise, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
See, I'm already having trouble describing, but just toe raise.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. But anyway, there's a point where it's like of knee flexion where you're still within an active range of motion of like the gastroc and the soleus will both be taking part in this like plantar flexion motion. Mm-hmm. But if you start bending the knee excessively, it's almost like you're putting this gastroc in a place where it's just not really able to like play a role in the plantar flexion motion. And so by default, you're going to get more soleus. But the question, and so that seems like on the surface, it might be a good idea, for bodybuilding purposes or whatever. But like, I'm inclined to agree with you based on the idea that you need everything that you can get to help stabilize a joint so that you get like the least amount of negative feedback into the joint itself. And it's similar to the same thing that we were talking about with the scapula. You want everything around that scapula to be able to like stabilize it against whatever forces come along, because joints, I mean, there's a little play in every single one of your joints. Yeah. It's not like there's like a strict axis and it like, and it rotates exactly and all you need is a pull like this. It's like everything around a joint constantly needs to be engaged to some degree in order to create this optimal centration of that joint throughout the entire range. And every single joint doesn't move on its own axis. Bones are like imperfect in the way that they move. So you're going to have every single joint, regardless of which joint it is going to have some degree of variability to its axis in the first place. So even like even like an elbow joint kind of moves around as it extends. And so you need as much stuff that you can, helping to put as many stabilizing vectors of force on this thing to carry it through a non-injurious range of motion in order to get optimal motion. So if you start taking pieces of whey, you may not feel it at first, but over years and years and years, I would think that you're likely starting to create light degradation of a joint, where you'll regret it in 20 years, constantly doing these types of things. I would rather reinforce positive and functional, strength and ranges of motion and movements that are going to actually like play a role in reality rather than just risking the bodybuilder point of view. But
I think it moves faster than that, actually, because I think what happens is, you start programming these these less efficient motor patterns, and that kind of starts a domino effect. So like you start doing this initially, and then it progressively gets like, it's like the better you get at it, the worse it is for you. And the less you are able to then, like, when you leave that, okay, I was doing this intentionally for the bodybuilding in this workout, but then all of a sudden you're doing it so much because you're doing it under load and for repetitions or whatever, you start carrying it over to like, now I picked my keys up off the floor, and like it just has this domino effect of like the amount of volume and exposure and the way it's affecting your motor patterns. I think it gets amplified because, I mean, the example that you use, like we had the guy, and for those of you guys, like basically what happened is we took a guy that had been doing a bunch of like over isolated, like lock it down style training and all of these like intention co-contraction thingies, right? And his motor patterns were so screwed up that even though like he had plenty of strength and range of motion, he did really weird, like his body didn't make good solutions to overcoming the resistance, right? Like instead of pressing with his elbow under the load, like he's like pressing, like like the chest press, like it's like his body was using like one of the least effective ways to possibly do this motion, because he's essentially wired those, like these motor patterns with all these excessive co-contractions. And I think
chasing a sensation.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's a huge, I mean, sensation is one of the toughest things I think that people are going to have grasping in terms of what it is and all the different types and whatnot. And so, which is tough because if you don't understand anything about biomechanics and all this other stuff, like most people are going in and they're like, well, does this feel good or not? Can I feel it where I want to? And so there's all of these little things that you can do that will create a sensation in something, but that sensation may be very negative feedback rather than positive feedback, right? So it's not that you shouldn't feel a muscle working, but there's a lot of reasons that you can have a sensation in a tissue or in a region that are actually telling you that like this is not the optimal way to do this, right? That's a topic for another day. So hopefully between what I like fumbled through in the podcast and what we went through today, people can understand that like from a pelvic stability standpoint, our goal, and this goes to, if we want to use the RP stimulus to fatigue ratio as another reason, is like anytime we disadvantage something, so if we take out the glutes, right, it's not that just like something has to make up for that, right, but something that's less efficient than the glutes, which means we are going to be getting a higher fatigue to stimulus ratio, more fatigue, less stimulus, because whatever is making up for those glutes in that sense is not going to be as good as glutes were, right?
Well,
there's never any...
it's going to take away from the battery power that your central nervous system has to put into the muscles you want to work if you're taking something away that it would normally have to rely on to stabilize. So, fundamentally, I don't believe that like if we're purposely inhibiting something, that's a good thing. I just... From just a purely up here, I think about the thing that's happening in the body. Like, I just don't think that that's a good idea. And some people might not agree with that. But
I think when we look at training and we look at trying, like especially for like bodybuilding style training, we're trying to mechanically advantage the tissue we want to train and we're trying to limit the mechanical advantage of other things, right? So I think it's okay to mechanically disadvantage something. When I say mechanically, I mean we position our setup or whatever so that like this has a really good opportunity to act on that load, and this other thing is obviously not going to be as good a solution. Like, I mean, that's all about what setting up for isolation exercises is it's about trying to, you know, set up and then do the movement in a way where the tissue that you want to train is the easiest and cheapest, best mechanical solution for that. And that's the best that we should do. The second we start like manipulating, the second we start doing internal manipulations, right, where we're now it's like, okay, now this is getting inhibited because I'm like overextending this or co-contracting that or whatever. Now I think we're disrupting our neurology, our motor patterns, and the integrity of the joints, right? It's one thing to say like, well, yeah, if I want to use more costal pec, I'm going to use the load this way because it mechanically advantages this and it disadvantages this. That's a perfectly viable solution, right? But saying like, well, I want to use more of this, but I don't want to use much of this, so I'm going to push out and down like and like do this weird like contractile thing or whatever, like that would be a stupid solution of trying to manipulate the contraction or manipulate the shoulder joint in a way instead of just letting the scapula and shoulder do what they need to do to overcome that resistance. So it's the resistance that should dictate what tissue is doing the most work, and we shouldn't be trying to disadvantage anything that is part of that system, right? You use the best tool that you have for the job, and at the end of the day, you have to accept it. And something like we really don't have any movements that are ever isolated to only one thing. Like at every joint, there's always redundancy, which I think is, you know, from an evolutionary standpoint, probably pretty damn smart, right? And from a joint integrity standpoint, probably also pretty smart, right? Every joint's got a unique, you know, story to it on why it would have these multiple things or whatever. But I mean, even something as simple as like, you know, like elbow flexion, right? Like how many elbow flexors do we have? I mean, you got two heads of the biceps, you got the brachialis, you got the brachioradius, and it's like 4 things to just do this,
you know?
right? You know, yeah, and the forearm, you know. So it's like, okay, well, if we're doing elbow flexion, all of those are going to be working to some capacity. Are there slight things that we can do to bias them? Yeah, but the solution to getting more out of what you want is not to like start Botoxing the ones that you don't want to use, right?
Oh, that'd be great, right? You're like, hey,
Yeah, right.
before you start the set, I got this little injection for you. We're gonna put it into.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I don't think we're too far off because right now you see people doing like they're doing like, okay, I'm going to put all the electrodes on, and if you can't contract your muscles, that's fine because I'm just going to shoot shocks into them for you, right? Which I don't think it's a good idea because I don't think it's a good idea from a motor pattern perspective, and I don't think it's like we're really getting more out of it, and I don't think it really transfers to the other training. I think the only thing you do is you end up building a bunch of metabolites up in people by just you know, basically you're just saying calcium, just keep pouring out, right? If anything, I think it might be bad for like mitochondrial health and movement patterns and whatnot, because it's not you're not managing the joint on your own anymore, whatever. But I don't think we're too far off to like, well, what if somebody develops the opposite system where it's like I can shut things off? Like I got an electrode on here that sends like an opposite, like a negative fucking ion signal or something. It's like makes this go boop.
Right.
Like I don't even know if that's possible, but you know,
I bet it is.
I mean, somebody's going to try and do that.
Yep. You would probably just send the opposite signal, whatever it senses is coming from the neuron, and then it would create like a null,
I mean,
out of the thing.
We're not
who knows?
We're not wired like positive, negative, but I mean, there's got to be something that would depolarize the neuron there in some way or something, or somehow put it in a state where our signal would essentially get drowned out. Is
right.
Probably how it would actually work, right? So as we're getting off into like, you know, completely irrelevant bullshit here. But that just goes to the thing. It's like, you know, somebody, because of this terrible rationale of like, oh, well, I don't want this to work, so let's just shut it off. When in reality, if something's working, there's a reason for it, right? You know, I mean, it's so egotistical for us to think that oh, well, I know better than my brain does on what should be contracting around this joint or whatnot. And reality is we are so underprepared to manage that stuff, right? Like none of you out there could consciously manage a contraction, period, right? Like if you had to control all those motor units to the varying degrees or whatever, like you can't even fathom how consciously complex that is. So the ego to think that we should start going in and manipulating what is acting around the joint by anything other than altering the resistance we're overcoming, I think it's just hubris, right?
Agreed. 100%. I've always said that, but in every aspect of our health and wellness or everything, like we really don't know what the hell we're doing. And for us to kind of, for real, for us to decide that just because somebody doesn't look a certain way here or there or whatever, that we know better and this is what should be happening, or like somehow we have x-ray vision and we can predict what's going on muscularly or, structurally underneath someone's skin. Like we don't have any idea what the hell is going on. So for us to just be like, well, this is tight, or I'm going to do this so it inhibits this, or whatever. It's like, you don't know that that's what's going on. And just because someone feels something a certain way doesn't mean that it could mean that you're forcing something to function in a way, inefficient way, that's actually doing more harm than good to the joint itself.
Right.
So.
All right. Any closing statements on the spine, sir? Any of those points?
Yeah, just keep on keeping on.
Yeah, right. So hopefully we explained enough of the rationale of why, a neutral from basically, cranium to coccyx, right? We want to be in neutral and resist flexion or resist whatever force is being acted on us out of neutral when we're trying to train any of the limbs, right? So you could say the same thing when we get into like back training and stuff like that. Is like once we choose a position or like most of that stuff, it's like a lot of people do like weird things, when they're doing back and chest training and stuff. And sometimes we have to do that logistically to be able to line the resistance up with the tissue. But, in most case scenarios, if there's an option to get in there with a closer to neutral spine, you're going to get better recruitment out of everything that we're trying to do from the limbs. And in terms of the pelvis and whatnot, it's a continuation of that, right? So try and make sure that you're expending all of the energy that you can on the tissue that you want, and everything else, make its life and as easy as possible. So cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
The cool thing about this is that it's pretty much based on consistent principles that work across the board. So, it doesn't surprise me that this is a topic of conversation, and I'm sure that we're going to have many more conversations that are pretty much identical to this, but pertaining to a different body part. It's literally the same thing. So it's nice that it's consistent, because then at least we have a little bit more certainty that we're on like the right track,
Yeah. When you see principles consistently work out in different areas, it's a really good tool for increasing the validation of that. All right. Cool. All right, guys. Thank you. We'll see you later. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.